Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. Joining us today is Nathan Lowder. Mr. Lowder is a soil health specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Services Soil Health Division, covering Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Puerto Rico. As a soil health specialist, he promotes soil health principles and provides trainings to help producers improve soil health on their operations. Mr. Lowder was raised on a dairy farm in southern Stanley County, North Carolina, which has transitioned into a beef cattle and row crop farming operation. He continues to farm with his family using mixed species cover cropping and no-till practices. In addition to his current role as soil health specialist, Mr. Lowder has held a number of other positions over the past 16 years at NRCS that worked with producers to address resource concerns and soil health efforts, including student trainee, soil conservationist, and district conservationist. Mr. Lowder earned his Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Environmental Technology from North Carolina State University in 2003. In this webinar episode, Mr. Lowder will introduce the soil health management practice of cover cropping. He will look at how cover crops can fit into existing conservation systems to improve soil health. He will also present different options for seeding and terminating cover crops to enable successful cash crop planting. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Lowder.
Thank you. So thanks, folks, for tuning in to this webinar. We're going to talk about cover crop management. I hope that the interest in cover crops is ever growing, so I hope that you find some information from this webinar useful to include into your operation. So we'll start this presentation by looking back at the soil health principles, because this is something that we always need to keep on our mind every day on our operations. And we're going to see how cover crops actually fit into making these principles actually work or function on your operation. So these are actually broken down. I just want to go back to those quickly. Minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, maximize biodiversity, and maximize living roots in our current rotations. And how are cover crops going to help us do that? Well, we can do that by maximizing cover, maximizing diversity, and also maximizing living roots while we use the actual operations of our planning or seeding to help minimize that disturbance. But cover crops are going to help us feed and also protect this living ecosystem that we have and we are building in our soils. So we have to think about the purpose of a cover crop. Of course, looking at it from an agency perspective, cover crops were widely used for for erosion control. But as producers are becoming more interested in cover crops, there's numerous resource concerns or objectives that producers may have that they want to utilize cover crops for. And here is just I say a small list, but actually cover crops has a tremendous list of things those objectives that they can actually meet. Some of those could be cover crop diversity in existing habitats or existing rotations, of course, erosion. Producers may want to build stable soil aggregates. A lot of producers are thinking about not only harvesting cash crops, but they're thinking about harvesting more rainfall as well, so improving that water cycle and availability. Also, producers may want to use cover crops to include or promote beneficial insects. Also, to build organic matter. That way we have a more resilient, functioning soil that can not only store more water, but also cycle more nutrients. And that just leads into the next bullet, and a nutrient efficiency cycling. Also, air quality, to keep that soil in place for areas of the country where the wind could have wind erosion. We could use these cover crops to adjust carbon and nitrogen ratios in existing crops, especially if you have rotations that have a species of cash crops that have very high carbon. We might could adjust that carbon and nitrogen ratio by putting in a legume cover crop or a mixture of different species to help offset that or balance that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Also, producers could have the impact or the interest in wanting some shelter or food for actual wildlife. And then lastly, we're also having producers that are interested in integrating livestock. That is a great addition to the soil health principles, is when we can integrate those livestock to mimic that of nature, of all the animals that used to roam across these great lands. And lastly, nitrogen fixation. Producers are looking for different ways to include inputs, not only through additions of amendments, but also naturally through the fixation of nitrogen by the use of legumes in these cover crop mixes. So a producer may come and may be thinking of this right now. And I want to compare the physical appearance of this cow, and a producer may be thinking of this as their soil, because they may be just fighting challenges and challenges and challenges year to year, and then in looking at this cartoon, and suddenly this morning, I noticed she didn't look so good. So we may have that same thought of our soil, that we have been in this same type of management, these same type of inputs, and we're just not seeing a sustainable productivity in those soils. So we may have come to the realization that, hey, we've got a problem. So we may have a resource concern that we need to address. So this is where NRCS would obtain a lot of the information to relate that to producers on the benefits of cover crops and how they may implement. And this is just a conservation practice standard of 340 cover crop. So as producers, this is something you could reach out to your local field offices, your NRCS staff, your soil and water staff, and talk to them about cover crops. So they should have this information available to assist you in technical assistance on planting on your land. Other things that we need to make considerations in these cover crops so we are successful is we have to think about the site preparation. We almost need to treat these, I'm going to back that up and say we need to treat these just as a high priority as our cash crops, when we understand how these fit into a system and how the benefits can be endless and when we can get these systems, these soil health management systems in place. So site preparation is key. Also early weed control. Now these cover crops, once they get established, can very much compete with a lot of the species that would be coming up at that time, but we may want to think about that to get those early weeds actually taken care of through some type of management. Also, we want to look at the timing and the species that we're going to use. How is that going to fit into your existing crop rotation? We don't want to ask producers to actually adopt a new cash crop just to where cover crops fit in. We want to see how existing rotations, cover crops can fit into those existing situations to where they could provide more benefits. Also, by looking at that crop rotation, we could actually use that cover crop to add more diversity to these systems. We'll also look at seed quality. Producers are very common. Well, I have some seed on hand. Can I use that? Of course you can, but we'll look at some different criteria that we would want to make sure that we take into consideration before we use that. We'll also look at different seeding methods, broadcasting versus drilling versus aerial applications, and we'll also look at seed size and seeding depth. Also looking at legume inoculation, because of course some rotations may include legumes currently, and these cover crop mixes may include more legumes. So we want to make sure that that we provide proper inoculation where that association can happen between the legumes and the bacteria, to where they can successfully fix nitrogen. And lastly, we'll look at some moisture management, cover benefits, water use. How can these things benefit that water cycle? Additionally, some cover crop considerations is we need to think about the residue management before and after the actual cover crop emerges. We have to think about those cash crops. And as equipment gets larger and larger, more producers are covering more and more acreage. Those headers and equipment are covering a lot more ground. So we want to make sure that the amount of ground that is covered by the actual harvest equipment, that residue is actually spread evenly behind that piece of equipment. That way it doesn't cause any planting issues. And also, we have to also think about that residue as a nutrient source as well. We will, of course, we touched on CDN ratios. We'll have to think about, is there some residual nitrogen left in these systems, especially following legumes like soybeans? Could we take benefit of that? Do we want to keep that residual nitrogen in that system? Of course we do, and we can do that and capture that by the use of these cover crops. Other considerations is, do we need to think about the insect and disease management, and also weeds, because that could be, as a producer, your objective, that you have tremendous or increasing weed pressure and insect or disease pressure that is coming in. So how can a cover crop fit into that to where we can help offset some of those challenges that are coming from those topics? Also looking at termination method and timing, what we're going to do, we need to know how we're going to terminate this cover crop as soon as we are planting it. We need to have that conversation. We need to have that thought process. We're planting this in some time of the year, 5 to 6 months from now. How are we going to actually get it terminated where we can be successfully in planting our cash crop into the existing residue? We'll also look at herbicide carryover and label restrictions. Those things are increasingly are getting more information to producers. And lastly, looking at some economics, yield impacts, cost of establishment, and soil improvement. So we have to ask ourselves as producers is, we have to, again, we want to see how these cover crops could actually fit into our existing crop rotation. So we have to think about, what is our seeding time frame? Well, of course, we have spring, early summer, late summer, fall, and other producers, depending on their cash crops, they may have other windows. But looking at the spring, of course, fallow ground, if we look back to this spring, there was a lot of prevented plant acres in the Midwest that was caused by a lot of excessive rainfall. So we may be had the opportunity to plant a cover crop where a cash crop would have been. Or also seeding into winter grain. Some areas of the country only have the opportunity to grow a wheat crop or small grain crop, and not enough time in the summer to grow another cash crop. So planting those after that winter grain. Early summer, that could be after early vegetable harvest or winter grain, or actually a forage harvest that came in a silage situation. Late summer could be after grain. Interseeding into corn, we have those producers that have short growing seasons, so they are pushing that envelope. They want to get those cover crops seeded as soon as possible. So interseeding into corn, not only corn, that could be soybeans and also cotton before that actual crop is even harvested. But you'll find that a lot of producers will elect to actually, as they are entering into this process, they're probably going to use fall after the actual cash crop is harvested. But again, I want to stress how important it is that producers think about this cover crop as just as much a priority as their actual cash crop. I know in working with some producers, in cotton especially, some of that time, that harvest could run into late fall and even into winter in some years. But those producers that are vested in that actual cover crop will have a cotton picker, a bush hog, and a no-till drill all in the same field, getting all these processes done. So they're harvesting, preparing, and planting their cover crop all at the same time. So we're going to look at some cover crop niches for our sun, because again, most of our cash crops are grown during the summertime. So we can see in the top left in A that we are missing a lot of opportunities to feed that system, or opportunity for those ecosystem services. We're providing inputs to that soil biology. So we can see that annual grain crop there in the center, and we have again on the spring and then on the fall where we have missed opportunities. But we can see just below that in B that if we start including cover crops that are being planted after our annual grain crop in the fall and then allowed to grow up to the spring and then terminated before that actual cash crop is planted, that we could start to increase those ecosystem services, those living roots, that diversity, that soil cover. that we could introduce into those existing rotations. And we could improve that even a little more, depending on where you are in the country or how comfortable you are with cover crops and actually planting your cash crops. You could see that in the top right-hand corner on the C, that we have those cover crops again planted after cash crop, but then we can see that that green shaded area actually comes into our annual grain crop. So what we can account for that is that producer was using and terminating that cover and planting into it at green at the time of planting that cash crop. And we can see also in D, areas that have short growing seasons or producers that are very vested and interested in getting cover crops seeded as soon as possible to where they can gain the most growth of those cover crops during that season that they would be successful in growing, that we can see that that green shaded area starts when that annual grain crop is starting to senesce, or that the maturity of the crop is already fulfilled and it is drying down in prepping for harvest, but we have opportunities to seed that cover crop into that annual grain crop at that time. And again, going into spring where it would be terminated before planting that annual cash crop. So some other considerations that we need to think about, of course, of the actual cover crops are their growth cycle, their growth habit, their root architecture, their growth rate, chemical composition, stress tolerance, time to flowering, and pest resistance. So thinking about that habit and architecture, we want cover crops that are kind of complement each other. If we have this, I'm going to use an example, hairy vetch. Of course, it would have a tremendous amount of time to grow and would grow very productively. However, it would have a tendency to mat and lay on the ground. So a producer may want to think about, well, I can include a small grain or something or another erect growing species that hairy vetch could actually utilize and kind of trellis and give it some support to actual grow. And they actually would complement each other as well. We also, in areas of the country where rainfall is limited, we could also think about how well these cover crops would relate to stress as well. If we're planting those in times that we would not have very much precipitation, we would need cover crops that could thrive in those conditions. Of course, time to flowering, we don't want to be including a cover crop that could rapidly go through its growth cycle, go to flower, and then produce viable seed that then could become a weed in our current cropping systems. So we want to make selections based off of that. Also, pest resistance or susceptibility, we want to make sure that we're not using species that could carry over or provide the habitat to be a host for pests that could be in these, that could damage our actual cash crops in the next growing season. So looking at this graph, I know there's a lot of numbers and it's kind of busy, but you know, we need to think about seed-in ratio. So that is carbon to nitrogen ratio. So everything is going to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we can see that over on the right, we have a turtle and we have a rabbit. And we have these actually broke down in terms of good for soybeans or good for corn. So we have to think about why those are good for soybeans or good for corn. So let's look at the ones that are good for soybeans. So we know soybean is a legume, so we can compare it to those species that are located lower on this chart. So with a lower seed-in ratio means that residues from that crop are higher, are going to be quicker to break down because they have a lower seed-in ratio. So it doesn't take as much nitrogen to actually offset the carbon of that actual residue. So it breaks down rapidly. But then we see things that are good for corn. So corn is a grass species. So we can compare it to the species that are listed at the top of the graph because they have high seed-in ratios. So we would require additional nitrogen or more nitrogen to actually offset that high carbon in each of the ratios of these different species. So if we have corn in the rotation, we definitely wouldn't want to plant a rye or small grain monoculture cover crop because we could be setting ourselves up for a penalty because there's going to be increasing amount of nitrogen that would be required to actually break down not only the corn residue, but also the residue from the actual cover crop that was being planted. So with that being said, we want to kind of find a happy medium, and that is where we could utilize and use these mixed species cover crops. We could include a small grain of some sort, and also a legume or a forb of some sort in these mixed species. That way we provide a balanced seed-to-end ratio. And we will see that as producers go down this path and become more and more used to these systems, is they will find that they more than likely will find a cover crop mix that works for them, and they usually stick to that same species mix just about for every crop that they utilize, unless they were looking for specific goals within a certain crop. So thinking about residues that we would have to deal with, let's think about cotton. Because cotton, the leaves of cotton, of course, are going to have a low seed-to-end ratio because they don't stick around very long after defoliation. However, that stalk is going to stick around for a long time. So I would equate that cotton stalk to having a very high seed-to-end ratio that we could probably compare to rye straw, or could even be higher. So providing a benefit of a legume in those species could help build nitrogen to help offset that. However, thinking about the residue that is left of the actual cotton stalks across the field, is we understand that once those leaves break down from defoliation, that there's not a whole lot of cover left on the soil surface. So we could actually, this is a great opportunity in cotton that we could have that mixed species cover crop, where we could have that balance of a small grain that is going to stick around throughout the growing season, and then the legume or a forb that could help offset that with a lower seed-to-end ratio. So let's just take a few minutes here to look at some of the cover crop species that we would be using. Now, for some of the producers that are looking at this, some of these may be your actual cash crops. But we would see that a lot of producers that are growing corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, are going to lean on these species, these cool season species, to utilize in their existing cropping rotations. So, of course, we have annual ryegrass that could be utilized with producers that in the thought or the chance of herbicide resistance. Annual ryegrass is not being used by as many producers unless they're using it as an actual forage that would be grazed, or unless you are in a little bit more northern climate. Annual ryegrass is widely used. The big staple, of course, is cereal rye. This is by far, I think, the best species that we could utilize. However, this may not be the best species for someone that is just starting the use of cover crops, because cereal rye has the opportunity or the potential to actually grow to over 6 feet tall. So if a producer has not been utilizing cover crops before now, and then had 6-foot rye residue to plant through next spring, that could be quite a daunting task and very challenging, and a producer would have a lot of questions going from fall to spring on the choices that they may have made. However, there are other opportunities. Barley, oats, wheat, triticale, all of those could be used as well. And they're going to provide, of course, a lower growing residue that may be more easily managed by a producer that is just starting this process. Warm season grasses, these may fit in existing rotations where vegetables are used, or grazing situations. Pearl millet, Japanese millet, sorghum Sudan grass, forage sorghum, teff, all these could be used. Forage sorghum and that sorghum Sudan grass have tremendous rooting systems that could help build a lot of aggregation and stabilize the soil during these warm growing season months. Looking at cool season broadleaves, these could be also included with those cool season legumes planted in the fall. Radishes are very, very popular amongst producers. Turnip, rape, kale, collards, mustard, phacelia, all these different species could be used. Just a word of caution on the radish. Usually, if you're North Carolina and further north, more times than not, those radishes are usually winter killed. If you're using turnips, those will not winter kill. So thinking about that in terms of planting your actual cash crop next spring, we have to think about, well, if there was ample fertility left over from the cash crop or in that existing system, there could be a tremendous amount of little, I'm going to think, mini basketball-sized turnips out there, or radishes if you're below North Carolina, further south, that could be an obstacle or a challenge to plant through. But that can be done, so I wouldn't want to scare producers away from using those. It's just the thought of how that's going to fit into the rotation, and then how is that going to fit in with my termination of these species as well. That way I can be successful in planting that annual cash crop. Also, we want to think, just going back to the opportunity for our actual cover crop species that we're using to actually become weeds. We have to think about that. And when we think about radishes or turnips or kale or collards or canola, we have to think about the growing, the habits of those. And we want to make sure that we actually terminate those cover crops before they produce that viable seed, to where they do not create further challenges in other growing seasons. Warm season broadleaves, of course, these could be complemented with the warm season grasses grown in as a cover crop mix, but also producers may be thinking about, if they're wanting to promote beneficials, these could be some species that could be planted in odd areas or on field borders, or even a producer that may be thinking about actually planting them in rows or offsetting rows with actual cash crops to promote beneficials throughout that entire field of the actual cash crop. Some of those could be buckwheat, safflower, or sunflower. And then thinking about how you may terminate those, again, before they produce viable seed within that cash crop or that growing season. Cool season legumes, again, these are going to be the most popular or staples included with those cool season grasses that we would be using. Of course, hairy vetch, purple vetch, common vetch, woolly pod. There's being more and more work done with these different species of actual vetch, that how they could fit in different growing or cropping rotations. Some of these, like the woolly pod, has been shown to increase or become more mature or reach its end of its growth cycle 2 weeks before either common or hairy vetch. So that may fit into a producer's rotation that they need to terminate that cover sooner to actually facilitate getting that cash crop in. Crimson clover, there are a tremendous amount of varieties. Most of these are reseeding clovers. They are annual in their growth cycle. And also there's more and more work being done in order to classify and see how quickly these mature. So producers may need to do a little bit of homework, a little bit of backgrounding on these to make sure that they would fit, especially if you were going to use a cover crop ahead of corn. In most areas of the nation, corn usually goes in pretty early. So if we're going to expend the capital or the funds for input of a legume cover crop, we want to make sure that we actually get the benefits of that. So making some guesses or educated guesses on which species of these we would want to use. Also, if you have the opportunity to have perennial cover in, of course, red, white, allspike clovers could be used. Also, producers are using winter peas, Austrian and Canadian winter peas in these rotations as well. Warm season legumes, cowpea, soybean, sun hemp, chickpea, mung bean. These are all species that could, again, complement those cool season or warm season grasses and also warm season forbs. But we can see that there's more and more increasing interest in sun hemp especially. We have a cover crop species with sun hemp that could be established after a warm season cash crop and still terminated before a cool season cash crop. So I'm thinking of something like either cotton, well, not necessarily cotton, but corn being harvested, sun hemp being planted, terminated, and then actual small grain being planted. Sun hemp has the ability to have a tremendous amount of growth in a short period of time and also produce a very large amount of nitrogen in that short period of time. So we've talked a little bit about legumes, and most producers are probably used to or comfortable with legumes in their existing crop rotations. But we have to think about these are different legume species that we're putting instead of the soybeans or some type of peas that we may have had in existing cash crops. So again, if we're going to expend capital or funds on a very expensive legume in our cover crop mix, we want to make sure that we're providing all of the tools that that legume seed will need in order to successfully produce nitrogen for us, because that was one of the premises that we wanted to put legumes in a cover crop mix, is to actually naturally build nitrogen in our systems for that actual next cash crop. And of course, the way we're going to do that is by providing the correct inoculant at the time of seeding. But we need to take special care of these inoculants and make sure that we actually use this cover crop as directed in order to get that successful relationship between that seed, the soil, and the bacteria within the inoculant. Again, I know as producers, I'm a producer myself, we have a tendency to throw things on the dash of the truck. Well, that could be the worst thing we could do with an inoculant, because those are living organisms, and that would be probably comparable to sticking this in the microwave and nuking all those bacteria. So we want to take special care of that inoculant, keep it in a cool, dark place right before we use it. Also, producers may be thinking about using seed that they have on hand. They may already have some cool season small grain crops in their rotation. And it's like, well, I can just utilize that seed for my actual cover crop that I'm going to plant. And in some cases, that is recommended. However, looking at this slide, there could be some definite considerations that I would want to take before I use this specific seed. So looking at this, I would think at a minimum, it would definitely need to be cleaned to some extent, depending on how I was going to seed it. But I would need to definitely clean this, because I'm seeing some chaff, I'm seeing some sticks, I'm seeing some fines, but also within those fines, I see some possible weed seed that I could very easily be being broadcast back out onto my existing cropland. So definitely want to make sure we take those under consideration. And we would also need to have the time to take a sample of this once we get it cleaned and prepared to use for seeding, is to send that off and see what kind of germ test that we have on those seed as well. If you don't send that off, we could also use just a simple ragdoll test where you take 50 or 100 of these seeds, put them in a wet paper towel, put them in a Ziploc bag, put them in a dark area for a few days, pull them out and count and see how many have actually germinated. You can form your own opinion on the germination of that seed. Of course, you may want to do more than one sample or different lots, but definitely want to have some idea of how much seed or how much germination you're going to have within that existing seed. So we have to talk a little bit about certified or VNS. So certified seed, of course, is a named specific variety. And we can see from this seed tag that I provided that this is emerald red clover. So if this was VNS, or variety not stated, this could be any red clover that was harvested and then cleaned and tested and then put into a bag. So why do you think that's important, that we have certified or VNS? Well, if we're growing, again, let's go back to the maturity or how quick those legumes actually mature. If we're shooting for an early maturing variety, then, and we use a VNS red clover, or let's say this is a VNS crimson clover, that may have species that mature 1 week, and then 2 or 3 weeks later we have other parts within that same cover crop that are maturing a lot later, because we don't know the specific variety that is contained in that bag. So producers are making those decisions to choose those specific certified varieties. And we also have to think about, what is PLS? Well, PLS is pure live seed. So we're going to do just a few quick calculations on this example of this exact label. So to figure out PLS is we have to take the purity times the germination. So we can see from this seed tag that we have pure seed of 65.5%, and we have a germination of 80%, plus we add the 10% for hard seed. So we already see that, let's assume that this is it is a 50-pound bag, we're not assuming, a 50-pound bag. We see that only 58.95% of this bag is going to germinate, or is pure live seed contained within this bag. So me as a producer, already knowing that clover or legume is an expensive input, or potential expensive input in our cover crop mixes, I'm already troubled by seeing that only 58% or almost 59% of that bag is pure live seed. So let's dive into this a little bit further. So PLS per bag, that 58.95% equates to 29 pounds of this bag, of this 50-pound bag, is pure live seed. So if we were shooting for a rate of 10 pounds per acre, what would be our seeding rate? So 10 pounds per acre is going to require 10 pounds divided by that 58.95 means that we're going to need 16.9 pounds to successfully get 10 pounds of pure live seed. So I know as producers we think of 10 pounds to the acre and we got 50-pound bag, well I can seed 5 acres, right? Doing these calculations we see that we're going to need quite a bit more in order to fulfill that. Also, back on this slide, one thing to note is we see that only pure seed of this bag is 65.5%. So where is that other 30-some-odd%? We would hope that the bag would be close to 100%. Well, we can see on this seed tag that there is a coating material of 34%. And we see at the very bottom that the inoculant, this seed is already inoculated, used is an organic peat-based product. And when we see that with a lot of clovers, that those are pre-inoculated and coated with these seeds. But we have to consider, if we know the source of those seeds and where they came from and how long it took to get there, then we may make the choice to utilize this type of seed that is already treated. But if we don't know the history of that and we want to be very conscious in being successful with our inoculants that we're using, it may be that we want to look and request raw seed or seed that had not been coated. That way we could be getting actually 50 pounds of seed per 50-pound bag that we purchase. So this may be a very daunting picture to a producer because we're thinking about how we seed things. How are we going to get this cover? I know you're talking about a cover crop mix. Well, how am I going to seed that? Do they make a drill with 5 or 6 different seed boxes that are going to contain every one of these different seeds that I can set a rate for? Well, in most cases, no. You may find drills that have large seed boxes and then a very small seed box for very small seed that could split this up a little bit. But I just want to give you an idea of how we're going to seed this cover crop mix. We can see that this is a warm season mix that was planted. We can obviously see sunflowers there. There's sun hemp, there's buckwheat, there's forage sorghum, there's grain sorghum, there's sorghum sudex. There's several different species in this mix, and we want to figure out how we're going to actually plant that. So a producer may, well, I have a grain drill. So we're actually going to tie some numbers to this in terms of what it costs per acre to actually plant it. So a drill is one way to do it, and I'm going to say it's probably, in my case, the best way to do it. But again, producers will give me kickback that it is the most time consuming. Of course, it does take time. But when we're looking at it economically, $16 to $18 per acre to actually run a grain drill, not including the cost of the seed. It does provide consistent row spacing, consistent results after we get this the calibration set, and it gives us good seed to soil contact. We have to think back to that picture just before some of those seeds were tiny, some of those seeds were large. We want to make sure that those larger seeded species actually get good seed-to-soil contact. It'd be great if we get all to have seed-soil contact, but if we have producers that are looking for different options on getting those seeded, some of those may be broadcasts. So we can see that, of course, being drilled. We can see some of the results that we have of that. And we can also see there's also the thought of, well, if I put all these seeds in a drill box or in a hopper or in any container, that those small seeds are going to settle out. So I can show you that this grain box here was full, and then this is the picture of the grain box after it is near empty. So we can see that we still see a tremendous amount of good uniform cover crop seed mix there. We can still see those small seeds that didn't settle through that entire mix and get all seeded at the beginning of that operation. What we find is as we include more species with different size seeds, is those mixes actually become very, very stable in that mix. And also just thinking about how we're going to set a rate for that. So let's just say that we wanted 50 pounds of this particular seeding crop or cover crop mix per acre. Well, what I have found, whether it be cool season or warm season, is we go for the largest component within this that's making up the largest portion of this cover crop mix. And it's usually going to be one of the grass species, more than likely. So for this one, it was forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass. So if I was going to set and calibrate for this particular mix, I'm going to go to the chart that shows that forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass and look at the 50-pound setting for that monoculture species. And that's where I'm going to start for mixing this whole entire cover crop mix of 50 pounds per acre. And then you can follow that calibration procedure for each piece of equipment, and you can fine tune that for each cover crop mix that you use. Once you get those things figured and set, find you a Sharpie marker, write that in the lid of the grain box, right there with that chart, because next spring, next summer, next fall, you're going to be looking for that same thing, because you're probably utilizing close to the same mix or the same species, and that way you can save yourself some time. You would have that already indicated on your Giro chart where you wrote it down from the last calibration procedure. Also, producers may have the opportunity to put an air box or air seeder on a harrow or vertical tillage. So we have to think about, back to those soil health principles, of course, if we want to minimize disturbance as one of our principles we're trying to achieve, this may not be an option. But if we have producers that are coming out of conventional management where there's a lot of tillage, this could be an opportunity. You may have some of this equipment already, and you could utilize purchasing or obtaining some type of air box where you can put this on that piece of tillage equipment to where you could actually seed or broadcast that cover through the delivery of air out to manifolds, out to diverters or dissipators, to where we could spread that seed ahead of that light tillage operation to get those seeds incorporated. Of course, this is a wide swath. Some of these things could run easily up to 40 feet or bigger. The biggest thing is make sure your air delivery is exactly to that same width or just a tad wider. Wide swath, and we can run fast speeds with this, so we can cover a lot of acres per day in terms of getting these cover crops established. So here you can see one that was added to a vertical tillage rig of some sort. And producers have, in these conversations that I've had with them, have mentioned that this is cheap. I'm going to wear out a very expensive drill in order to actually plant cover crops. And they say, well, I can use this vertical tillage rig or some other type of tillage, and it'd be a lot cheaper. Well, looking at the math or looking at some rates for these actual pieces of equipment, it's around $17 an acre for the vertical tillage, and then $12.50 an acre for broadcasting if you didn't have that air seed attachment or some type of delivery broadcast method mounted on the tool. So in terms of, this could be a little bit more expensive route. Of course, it's going to apply, since this broadcast is going to provide random spacing and there is that result of having soil disturbance in these types of seeding methods. Producers may want to fly it on. Flexible timing, of course, we want to think about timing in terms of getting some adequate rainfall after the actual application of that, but it's going to be about $12 to $18 per acre, just depending on where you are in the country. Of course, provides random spacing, not guaranteed seed-to-soil contact, so you're going to have to increase your rates when you're broadcasting, and we're going to make sure that we need to have some adequate moisture following that seeding event. But it does provide producers that may have a tremendous amount of acres to cover. They may choose to use multiple types of seeding methods, especially if you was interseeding this into a standing soybean field at leaf drop, cotton field at defoliation, or corn crop at dry down. These could be utilized through using an airplane. So we have to think about what is our objective for having that cover crop specifically in your rotation. So I just want to use an example of weed suppression. So if I want weed suppression, I want a very uniform cover crop that is being planted and actually growing. So that way when I terminate it and maybe roll that on down to the soil surface, that I'm going to have a very uniform coverage. Because if weed suppression is my goal, I want to be able to, that cover crop intercepts the sunlight before it hits the ground that will enable those weed species to grow. So we want to make sure if we have it flew on or broadcast on, that we get that uniform coverage across the field. So there is opportunity that with broadcasting or flying it on, that we could get some in the road, some on the neighbors, some in the trees. So this, square fields, flat land, this may work pretty good in areas where you have small, irregular fields with a lot of tree lines or a lot of obstacles. That this may not be the best method for you if weed suppression is one of your resource concerns or objectives in using a cover crop. We can see some results of that three-way blend that was interseeded into soybeans at leaf drop. Another thing to think about in some of our cash crops, especially soybeans, when we seed these cover crops, we have to think about the harvest as well. So we can think about soybeans being harvested very low to ground, and if we have a wet fall, then we may have opportunity for cover crops to get quite a bit of growth on them. So that could be a challenge during the harvest of the actual cash crop of soybeans in some years. But again, those challenges can be overcome. We can see that those cover crops are becoming established. However, we can see that the shade of the corn is suppressing. Those things are germinated and growing, but they're being suppressed by the shade of the crop. But actually, when those crops are starting to dry down, they provide more sunlight to the soil surface within the canopy, and those cash crops can easily replace that after it is harvested. Using a high boy for cover crop, I've seen multiple variations of this type of equipment. This one is a high boy with an air seeder. I've seen sprayers retrofitted with three-point hitch broadcast seeders that are utilizing the same tracks, defoliating cotton, spreading cover crop seed, all at the same time. Give producers an idea of how to do something, and they are very, very inventive on how they can actually do that when they want to meet those objectives of getting that cover crop seeded. Again, I would say that using these interseeding methods would be for primarily used where producers are faced with short growing seasons. So they want to make sure that they have the opportunity to get cover crops seeded. Again, we can utilize the existing equipment that we have. You can see that this planter was a bean planter that they actually provided in change meters or seeds, seeding cups to where they actually could plant their cover crop mix. And they actually, in this case, utilized two different species. So we can see a grass growing and then some type of forb, probably radishes or turnips in some case, and put those on precision rows. That way they could actually come in and terminate that and maybe plant or just offset plant of, let's say, the radishes that were that natural subsoiler that they were using. That way, the cash crop roots could provide or be provided ample opportunity to get deep roots into that soil. Another inventive way, producers putting air seeders on their harvest equipment. We can see this one on a grain platform where it is dispersing seed out across the width of that header, and then the chaff or the residue coming out of the rear of the machine is covering that seed. So again, inventive ways, producers are going to find different ways to get these things seeded out in a timely method. So we see that this one was a ryegrass crimson clover mix that was planted with that air system. We can see that we get pretty good consistent results with this because we're covering that seed with residue from that combine as well. Interseeding, this is mainly done in corn. Again, back to short growing seasons, but I could see promise to where this actually might come in to some applications with cotton, just depending on the objective of the producer, whether they're wanting to get that cover crop mix seeded early, or maybe they're wanting to interseed a beneficial flowering a plant that can provide some habitat for beneficial insects within the actual cash crop that is growing. So we're going to talk briefly about cover crop termination methods. Of course, you can see these bullets, frost termination in some cases, a crimper or a roller, but we have to think about using a crimper as a sole method of termination, that those cover crops have to be mature enough to actually kink that stem. So those species are going to be later in their growth cycle that would facilitate the actual termination by just crimping those. Using a roller, that could be a flat roller, a cultipacker, a power pole, anything that would be dragged across the ground to actually get those cover crops onto the soil surface. Is it going to kill some of them? Maybe some of it, but it's more than likely going to require our next bullet some type of herbicide to burn that down. Producers also could be using grazing as a means to terminate that, where they put or concentrate cattle through proper rotational grazing to where they could actually come in, take 40 to 50% of the residue with the animals, and then the animals tromp down or trample the rest of the residue down to the soil surface. Organic producers or vegetable producers may want to shred or mow the actual residue. This is going to facilitate that residue breaking down faster because we are sizing that residue when we go through this type of termination that is opening up more surface area to the biology to break that down. Also, when it breaks down quicker, it's also going to be releasing nutrients quicker as well. Also, some producers may actually green manure or turn some of these residues under, but we'll actually find that producers will need to be flexible, and they may use, or most times will use, a combination of these methods every year. So thinking about this cover crop, termination how and when. Again, if you're a very experienced no-tiller and used cover crops for years and years, I say no-till could be some very minimal strip till, that you may want to grow those cover crops as big as you can get them. That way you're providing as much biomass, as many living roots while that cash crop or that cover crop is growing, and then providing as much residues back to the soil surface to where through those living roots and the residues we can start to build more and more carbon. But we have producers that are just starting this venture, so they may want to terminate that cover crop well before it gets to the stage of where the producer is standing in the top right-hand corner, to where they may maybe more easily manage that cover crop, terminate it, and become more comfortable of successfully planting into these types of residue. So for cover crop termination, it's going to depend. And again, this is where the use of these producers are going to see that they need to be flexible year in and year out. You may have producers that run into a dry spring that terminate the cover crops early, or they may run into a spring that is very wet and actually utilize the cover crops to help pull some of that moisture out of those fields to where they can facilitate planting. So it's going to depend. Another thing to think and take into consideration is we have, with increasing weed pressure and increasing herbicide-resistant weeds, is that we as producers are counting on using more and more residual herbicides in our existing cropping rotations. So, you know, we're conscious of, well, how is that going to affect the next cash crop, but we also need to be conscious on how is that going to affect the cover crop that we're going to see immediately following this cash crop. So we can see that this is a picture here on the right of where a cover crop was seeded. However, we see that we're missing a tremendous amount of the stand. And this was in some variety of corn where a very long-lasting residual herbicide or some type of chemistry was used that was still in the soil that did not agree or terminated some of those cover crop species that were trying to emerge through that soil. So we can see that we want to make sure that we read those labels. I will say that as we get further down this soil health path and implementing these soil health management systems, and as our organic matter increases, we'll see that we don't see near the impacts if those residual herbicides are being used, because that higher organic matter is breaking down or decreasing the half-lives of that herbicide chemistry. But also want to make sure that we review those labels and count on your experience of the area and of your soils and how they work. Just a few years back, the labels lacked a tremendous amount of information regarding cover crops. You could look on those for each specific species of cover crop you were trying to plant and somebody growing those as cash crops, but those labels are starting to get better. We can see that the bullet for cover only, soil building or erosion, maybe something you find on the label. So it's going to say at your own risk, review labels, count on your experience. And it's going to say, of course, observe and consider the climate and the soils of your area. Do you have that high biological activity that can break those down? So looking at insurance guidelines, and I apologize, I think this map is in the process of being updated or may have been updated, but we can see that across the nation, we have 4 different zones where cover crops, the policy on those, how they can be used. So I'm going to say here for North Carolina and most of the East Coast that we're going to be in Zone 4. Terminate cover crop at or within 5 days after planting, but before the actual crop emerges. So that provides a tremendous amount of opportunity to be getting cover crops in these existing rotations. I'm just going to quickly look at just a few resources, because producers are going to have increasing interest and increasing questions about some of these species that they may have never heard of. So again, reaching out to your local NRCS or Soil and Water District office could provide you some technical assistance on species that are adapted to the area. But you have the opportunity as producers also to, educate yourself. This is a cover crop chart that was developed by ARS, Ag Research Service. You can easily find that by typing ARS cover crop chart in any search engine, and it'll pull it up. It's an interactive chart here that kind of mimics the periodic element chart. But you can see it's broken down into grasses, cool, warm, broadleaves, and legumes based off of their growth cycles. And you can also see up at the top that there's information on growth cycle, plant architecture, and relative water use. So all you would have to do is click on these specific varieties, and it would take you to a different part of this chart that would give you specific information on each of these species. Other resources, of course, there are increasing cover crop councils. Midwest Cover Crop Council has been established a long time. There is now a Southern Cover Crop Council that covers Southeast and Mid-South states. There is a Northeast Cover Crop Council that has been established, and there's also been a Cover Crop Council that is in its infancy in the western part of the U.S. So you could rely on doing search engine searches for them. I know the Southern Cover Crop Council has an online resource for utilizing cover crops in coastal plain soils. Most of that research was coming out of South Georgia, but could easily be related to a lot of different areas within the Southeast. Also, I'll say we can see that Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, SARE. If we do a search for them, they have a tremendous amount of online books. And the great thing about them in cover crops is that they have free downloads. If you're attending any cover crop conferences or ag conferences throughout the winter months, sometimes you can find free copies of these publications laying around. But this Managing Cover Crops Profitably that was published by SARE is a tremendous resource for producers that could get more information about cover crops. And I'll also say that any ag publication that you pick up is starting to include more and more information about soil health and cover crops. So you'll find that your no-till farmers, your successful farm, and your progressive farmer, and there's many different ag publications that are going to have increasing information. Also, as cover crops become more popular, there's also seeding companies that are becoming more and more of interest. So various industry cover crop calculators are out there that can help you make some seed mix decisions, seeding rate decisions that can help a producer facilitate being successful in planting these cover crops. So with that, I appreciate you taking the time to visit in with this webinar, and I hope that it has given you some information on being successful in including cover crops into your existing rotation to improve soil health.
Thank you, Mr. Lowder. We really appreciate you sharing your cover crop expertise with this Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar. If anyone has any questions for Mr. Lowder regarding his presentation, you can contact us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org. And in our next webinar episode, David Lamb will be talking about regenerating soil health and planning a soil health management system. So subscribe to our channel to access new episodes of Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton as they are released. Have a great day, everyone.